I was standing in a cold, dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of Morelos, staring at a wooden table. On that table lay two objects, a pistol and a rosary. The pistol gleamed under the flickering light, polished and ready. The rosary looked innocent beads of black wood, a simple cross at the end worn from years of use. But in that moment, both carried the same weight: life or death. He sat across from me, unmoving. The same man I had once seen raise trembling cartel bosses to their knees with nothing but a prayer. His cassock was pristine, the crucifix on his chest glowing like fire in the dark. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. He simply looked at me. And then he spoke my full name slowly, like he was reciting it from a prayer book. He mentioned my mother, my sister. He brought up things I had whispered during confession years ago, secrets I had buried so deep I forgot they were even real. "I know your doubts," he said. "I felt them in your silence. But God is merciful, and He gives even the traitor one last chance to kneel." That was the moment I realized I had never truly escaped Him. I had crossed borders, changed identities, buried my past under fake passports and back-alley deals. But I had carried His shadow with me all along. It clung to me like smoke, sweet, holy, and suffocating. You think the Beltrán Leyva cartel was led by Alfredo or Hector. You think the men with gold chains and bloodied boots were the true devils. No. The real power wore black robes, spoke softly, and claimed to serve God. I remember gripping the edge of that table torn between the gun and the rosary. One promised forgiveness, the other promised freedom. But neither could save me from what he had already done to my soul. I was a sicario once. I've seen bodies torn apart by gunfire. I've walked through rivers of blood and stood over enemies gasping their last breath. But none of that ever haunted me like the words he whispered during Mass. "Dios bendice tu misión, y el mal caerá por tu mano." God blesses your mission. Evil shall fall by your hand. That was the lie I believed. That was the poison that seeped into our guns, our minds, our prayers. But before I tell you how I escaped that poison, if escape was ever truly possible, let me take you back. Back to the first time I saw him. Back to the finca in Morelos. Back to when I still believed that God had chosen us to kill. Because until you understand how the blood was baptized, you'll never understand the man who turned holy water into fuel for war. I was born in a village where the church bell was louder than the law. A place tucked between the hills of Guerrero where the roads turned to dust and the only jobs worth fighting for were the ones that paid in fear. My mother raised me with prayers. My grandmother walked me to Mass every Sunday, and I was taught that the cross was the last light against the darkness. But we were poor. Not the kind of poor where you skip lunch, the kind where you boil water and call it soup. My father had tried to live clean, to farm, to raise animals. But clean doesn't last long in a land owned by shadows. One night, he refused to pay a tax on the few goats we had. That same week, they found him face down in a ravine. 2 bullets to the back of the head. That was my first communion with death. At the funeral, the same priest who'd blessed my father's wedding now whispered something strange as he looked at the coffin. Some debts are collected by men, others by God. I didn't understand it then, but I never forgot. After that, the house got quieter, colder. My mother worked 2 jobs, one legal, one not. I helped harvest crops during the day and cleaned rifles for a cousin at night. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew the guns weren't for hunting animals. We had no heroes, only survivors. And the older I got, the more I realized survival had a price. Around 15, I stopped going to school, started hanging around the wrong people, the ones who had bikes cash and the confidence to look a cop in the eye. I watched them walk into church with thick envelopes and walk out with blessings. The same priest who wept at funerals now smiled at killers. It broke something in me. At 17, I was already good with weapons. Not proud, just precise. I kept my mouth shut, followed orders, and learned the rules fast. Loyalty is life. Doubt is death. One night, a man named Gregorio showed up at my door. He didn't say much, just handed me a duffel bag and said I had a job. "You're going to Morelos," he said, "to watch the gate. Just the gate." I thought it would be like other gigs, guarding stash houses, escorting shipments, maybe a little muscle if things got loud. But when I arrived at the finca, something felt different. It wasn't the security, the silence, or even the way the guards avoided eye contact. It was the tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something sacred or deadly. That night we were told to prepare for a visitor. Some of the older sicarios started cleaning their boots and tucking in their shirts. I laughed, thinking maybe a politician was coming through. Then a whisper passed through the finca, "El Obispo viene." The bishop is coming. I thought it was a joke. A priest visiting a cartel hideout, but when he stepped out of the SUV wearing black robes and a golden crucifix that caught the moonlight, everyone went still. Even the capos lowered their heads like children at Sunday school. He didn't ask for power. He already had it. And that was the night I stopped believing that good and evil were on opposite sides of the line. The first time I saw him up close, I thought I was dreaming or hallucinating from too many sleepless nights. He moved through the courtyard like he owned it, yet nothing about him screamed cartel. No guns, no entourage, just a man dressed in black holding a silver crucifix that swung lightly against his chest like a ticking clock. "El Obispo está aquí," someone whispered again, like an incantation. The silence around us was thick. Even the guards who usually joked before missions stood in line like altar boys. Alfredo. El Mochomo himself, cold, calculated, deadly, lowered his eyes when the bishop approached. That image stayed with me longer than any shootout. A cartel boss bowing his head to a man of God. The bishop didn't smile. He didn't bless us one by one. He asked for agua bendita, holy water, and began to sprinkle it over the rifles we had leaned against the walls. His words were soft but heavy. "With this water, I baptize these instruments as weapons of justice to defend the innocent and destroy the wicked." I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not adrenaline, something deeper, something like peace. For a moment, I believed the sins we were about to commit had been erased before they even happened, that God was walking with us into the storm. That night changed everything. From then on, the bishop's visits became ritual. No one announced him, but we always knew when he was coming. The finca would be cleaned, guards would shave and polish their boots, and the air would shift. He always arrived in an unmarked SUV, never flanked by bodyguards, but never once challenged. His power was silent and absolute. He wore the same black cassock every time. His cross was always polished, his words always slow and deliberate. But what shook me most was how even the most brutal men killers with no mercy transformed in his presence. Men who never flinched at gunfire suddenly knelt at his feet, eyes closed, waiting for his hand on their heads. I watched Alfredo make the sign of the cross like a child, listened as the bishop told us we were fighting a righteous war, that every bullet we fired was a seed of divine order in a world drowning in chaos. It sounds insane now, but in that moment, under the weight of his voice, the heat of the rifles and the stink of sweat and incense, it made sense. More than sense, it felt holy. He told us God had chosen us to cleanse the earth, that we weren't criminals, we were vessels of sacred justice. It was the first time I truly understood how faith could be weaponized, and I believed him. We all did. I remember one mission in particular. We were headed to intercept a rival convoy, and the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Just before we left, he arrived. No warning. He walked straight up to the truck's bottle of holy water in hand and blessed each armored vehicle like it was a soldier heading into war. "These are the shields of angels," he said. "No evil shall touch them." And I believed that too. I climbed into my truck that night feeling invincible, not because of the bulletproof glass or the AK in my lap, but because I thought heaven was riding with us. I didn't know it then, but that belief would be the most dangerous weapon of all. The first time we called it a ritual, we were half joking. By the third time, no one laughed. By the 10th, it had become gospel. Every major operation began the same way. We'd line up in the courtyard, rifles, cleaned, boots, polished faces blank. The air always smelled like gun oil and sweat, sometimes with a faint trace of incense. And then he'd appear, always dressed in black, always calm. The bishop didn't shout or raise his arms like some televangelist. He whispered prayers. He moved slowly, methodically, as if every second was sacred. He would dip his fingers into a small silver container of holy water and sprinkle it over our weapons, our trucks, our heads. "Blessed are the hands that carry the sword in the name of justice," he'd say, "for they strike not in anger, but in divine order." We believed him. God help me, I believed him. I remember a night in Culiacan. We were preparing to wipe out a rival cell that had been extorting locals and hijacking our shipments. We'd scouted them for weeks, confirmed their location. The plan was clean and cruel. Go in fast, hit, hard, leave, no one breathing. But before we rolled out, the bishop arrived. He walked the line, murmuring prayers over each of us. When he got to me, he paused, placed his hand on my chest, and said, "The heart that hesitates will miss the mark. Let no fear steal your purpose." I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I felt his touch like a brand burning through my ribcage. And when we left like crusaders. Not sicarios, not murderers, crusaders. That night we painted the streets red. It wasn't a firefight, it was a slaughter. We cornered them in a warehouse and opened fire. No mercy, no questions. When it was done, the walls dripped. A dog wandered in, sniffed the blood, and ran off whimpering. And I stood in the middle of it, breathing heavy, hands shaking, but not from guilt. I felt clean, because before the blood, we had been washed, because the bishop had said we were instruments of God, because he had given us permission. Later that night, when we returned to the finca, no one talked about what we'd done. Instead, we gathered for a short prayer. The bishop led it, eyes closed, hands raised. "Justice has been done. The wicked have fallen. Let the Lord receive them as he sees fit." We bowed our heads. No one wept. No one repented. That was the trap, the most powerful one of all. Not the guns, not the drugs, not even the money. It was the absolution. The lie that you could kill in the name of heaven and still sleep like a child. But I didn't know it was a lie. Not yet. We kept doing it. Over and over, before every major hit, before every ambush. We waited for the bishop. We craved his prayers the way junkies crave a fix. And every time he blessed us, we felt unstoppable, unbreakable, untouchable. Until the day came when we started asking ourselves something terrifying. If we're soldiers of God, then what happens when God starts giving orders that no man should follow? You'd think a man like that would hide in the shadows. But no, he stepped right into the light. The bishop didn't just bless weapons and whisper to killers behind closed doors. He began showing up in public small villages, forgotten towns, places where the government had failed, and the people clung to any sign of order. And he gave them just that. Masses were held in dusty plazas under makeshift tents. Whole communities gathered to hear him speak. Mothers brought their children. Grandmothers knelt in the dirt. And we were there, armed, masked, and standing watch. Not as threats, but as protectors. That's how the people saw us. Because if the man of God said we were there for them, who were they to argue? He spoke of wolves dressed as sheep. He never named names, but we all knew who he meant. Rival cartels, outsiders, sometimes even local politicians who dared to resist. He never mentioned us, never hinted that the very peace he preached was built on bodies dumped under bridges. But the people didn't ask questions. They just nodded. They clapped. Some cried. I remember one mass in a village near Chilpancingo. A woman, maybe in her 50s, grabbed his hand and kissed it, whispering, "Thank you for bringing back peace." And peace somehow was what they felt. They didn't see the executions that made it possible. They didn't see the teenagers who vanished for speaking out, the families who paid taxes or disappeared. They saw a priest. They saw his men. And they believed. That was the brilliance of it. He wasn't just protecting us from sin, he was sanctifying our image, turning blood into charity, turning cartel into guardian. He built clinics, funded school supplies. One town even had a library erected in his name. The plaque outside read, "A gift from the community, guided by the grace of God." But I knew the truth. I'd helped unload the crates of rifles hidden beneath the books. I'd watched as duffel bags of cocaine were stacked behind the altar of a cracked old church. I'd heard him pray as we buried blood-stained dollars beneath the floorboards. I carried the guilt in silence. Sometimes I'd catch myself in the mirror, before a mission, face-hard eyes, dull crucifix hanging from my neck like a badge. I'd ask, am I doing this for God, or just for him? I wanted to believe in the mission. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were cleaning the streets of something worse, that the bishop was some twisted kind of necessary evil. But deep down, a voice I hadn't heard since childhood started whispering again. The voice of my abuela holding my hand during Mass, the scent of incense, the softness of hymns, the quiet truth that murder was a sin no matter how you dressed it. And yet there I was, carrying a rifle, blessed with holy water, stepping over corpses to guard a priest who told us we were angels in disguise. It was the perfect illusion, a stage play where crime wore vestments and virtue was just another mask. But the scariest part wasn't the lie we told the world, it was the lie we told ourselves. And I was starting to believe it. At first, we thought he was just a priest with strange ideas, a holy man playing dress-up in a war he didn't belong to. But that was before he started giving orders. It began subtly. He'd offer advice during meetings, quoting scripture like a diplomat, using scripture as law. But soon he was sitting at the same tables as capos, holding the floor like a general. And when the bosses spoke, they looked to him not for forgiveness, but for approval. He had become indispensable. One night, we were stationed at a finca outside Cuernavaca. Tensions were high. A local police commander had begun setting up illegal checkpoints, harassing our convoys, confiscating shipments under the pretense of law. Most of us wanted him gone permanently. Alfredo had already given the nod. We were sharpening blades. Then the bishop raised his hand. He didn't yell. He never needed to. His voice was soft, measured. "Not yet," he said. "Violence leaves ashes, but trust leaves roots." Instead of an execution, the commander was invited to dinner. The man arrived trembling, expecting a bullet. What he got instead was wine prayer and the bishop's arm around his shoulder, like an old friend welcoming him home. By the end of the night, he was one of us. A week later, He was tipping off routes, diverting patrols, and pocketing more cash than he'd made in a year. I realized then that the bishop wasn't a symbol, he was a strategist, and his greatest weapon wasn't God. It was guilt. He knew how to manipulate fear, faith, and family. He could sit across from a sicario, haunted by what he'd done, speak 5 words in the right tone, and turn him into a loyal dog for life. He didn't ask for loyalty. He manufactured it. That's when the rituals changed too. It wasn't just about blessing our rifles. He began presiding over pacts. I was there the night we met with a delegation from the Zetas. 2 rival worlds filled with guns and blood feuds. We thought it would end in gunfire. Instead, the bishop walked in with a silver chalice, placed it at the center of the table, and said, "Before business comes brotherhood." He poured wine and made each man drink from the same cup. He led them in prayer. Grown killers, scarred and ruthless, reciting psalms like choir boys. The silence after the last word was suffocating, not from fear but from belief. I watched that scene unfold and felt something twist in my stomach. That was his real power, not control over men, but control over meaning. He could take a murder and call it justice, take a massacre and name it mercy. By now, even the capos deferred to him. Orders were passed only after consulting him. Executions delayed until he gave his blessing. Routes changed alliances, formed decisions pivoted, all based on his quiet counsel. I remember thinking, are we the cartel? Or is he the cartel? He didn't need guns. He didn't need soldiers. He had us. And once you've handed your conscience to a man like that, there's no taking it back. He didn't need chains. He had our secrets. Confession was supposed to be sacred, a moment between a sinner and his God, sealed forever behind closed doors. But with him, it was different. The bishop turned every whispered sin into a thread, and soon we were tangled in his web so tightly we didn't even notice we'd been bound. It began like tradition. Before every major mission, some of us would sit with him in a quiet room, not to plan, not to strategize, but to confess. I did it once. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid of dying. Maybe I just needed someone to hear the names. The innocent ones. The ones who didn't deserve the bullets. I told him everything about the child who cried over his father's body, about the woman who screamed my name as she bled out, about the nights I drank myself into silence. He didn't flinch. He didn't judge. He placed his hand on my head and whispered, "You are forgiven. This is a necessary war, and the blood you spill serves a greater purpose." I left that room feeling lighter, not better, not absolved, but lighter. Hours later, I helped ambush a convoy. I shot a man in the back as he ran, and I didn't feel a thing, not guilt, not rage, just purpose. That was the danger, the real poison. He didn't just pardon your sins, he rebranded them. And over time we became addicted to that feeling, like junkies chasing a fix, except our drug was forgiveness. But the deeper truth came later. It started when I noticed how he used our words. Not directly, never a threat. But he'd say things in meetings, casual phrases, gentle reminders that made it clear he remembered. That he could unearth your confessions at any moment. He'd look at a man across the table and say loyalty is precious, especially for those who've broken it before. He'd smile at another and ask, "How is your daughter?" The one you promised you'd never involve. Nobody ever responded. Nobody had to. We all knew what it meant. He had our hearts, our sins, our pasts. He owned us. There were men in our circle who feared no bullet, no rival, no prison. But they feared him. Not because he could kill them, but because he could unmask them. I remember one night at a ranch. He arrived late, unexpected. A few of us were drinking, playing cards, laughing a little too loud. He walked in, smiled, and said, "Men who laugh too easily often carry the heaviest guilt." The room went dead silent. I saw a capo excuse himself, face pale. Another poured out his glass without a word, and I realized in that moment we weren't soldiers anymore. We weren't even criminals. We were prisoners, not of the cartel, not of the state, but of a man who wore the cloth like armor and used the confessional like a blade. It was in Cuernavaca on a night thick with secrets. I had been assigned to escort him not for protection, but for presence. He was headed to a meeting in the back room of a colonial estate, the kind of place with thick stone walls, expensive wine, and enough ghosts to haunt a generation. Inside were men who didn't bleed, politicians, businessmen, judges, the kinds of men who made laws and then rewrote them after midnight. I expected charity talk funding churches, sponsoring orphanages, the usual theater. But what I witnessed was a negotiation of silence. They offered him favors, laws delayed raids, canceled permits approved. In return, he offered protection, not physical, but spiritual. The church's blessing. The bishop's silence. It wasn't bribery, it was liturgy. And when it ended, he didn't thank them. They thanked him. Later that night, back at the sacristy, he asked me to help retrieve a box from a cabinet. Inside, wrapped in worn cloth, was a small black notebook. He opened it without fear. There were names, dozens, maybe hundreds. Each line, a title, a date, a sin. Notes scribbled in margins, some in red ink underlined. Military generals, priests, mayors, journalists, narcos, even other bishops. It was a map of corruption handwritten by a man who never forgot a secret. And suddenly, everything clicked. This wasn't a man playing both sides. He was holding them. The bishops, the bosses, the law, even the church itself. He had built a kingdom not with bricks, but with guilt. I asked him once during a quiet moment why he kept the notebook. He looked at me, smiled gently, and said, "Even God keeps records, hijo. So must his servants." From then on, nothing we did felt autonomous. Alfredo and Hector, supposed leaders of the Beltrán Leyva empire, rarely made a move without first speaking to him. Orders would come down the chain, and everyone knew they weren't his. Not really, because behind every decision was a whispered conversation, a nod of approval, a passage from scripture twisted into command. Then came the loss of a massive shipment near the border. Tension exploded. Accusations flew. Men were about to die. But the bishop intervened. He asked for 48 hours. No one dared say no. 2 days later, he returned with names, exact locations, how the leak happened, who had taken bribes. The precision was surgical. Everyone froze. 3 men were executed that night. The cargo was recovered. No one questioned where the information came from, and from that moment on, I knew the most dangerous man in our world wasn't a capo, a killer, or a politician. It was the man in black robes with a book of sins and a smile that knew too much. By then, I had stopped believing in redemption. Not because I no longer believed in God, but because I knew he wasn't the one listening anymore. The bishop had made himself the sole gatekeeper to heaven and hell, and we had handed him the keys. But I still dreamed of escape. In the quiet hours when the finca was still and the radios silent, I would sketch plans on cigarette cartons. I had contacts coyotes near Sonoita, fake IDs from Puebla, cash stashed in double bottoms of duffel bags. I even buried 2 suitcases under a cedar tree in the Sierra, near where my father once herded goats. Still, I hesitated, because every time I moved forward, something pulled me back. A phrase someone shouldn't have known, a glance that lingered too long, a joke made with too much knowledge. He knew. I don't know how, but he knew. One night, I overheard two guards whispering about a sicario who tried to disappear. They found him strung up from a highway overpass, a rosary tied around his neck, a sign stapled to his chest that read, "Traitor to God and the Cartel." That's when it hit me. The bishop had his own way of delivering judgment. Those weren't just threats. That was doctrine. And then came the private mass. He called me to a ranch chapel in Morelos, just me, no security, no excuses. I thought maybe he wanted to talk. Maybe he would offer guidance. But halfway through the liturgy, as he read from the Gospel of John, he looked straight at me and said, "There is a Judas in every generation, one who kisses with betrayal." I couldn't breathe. My hands went cold. My pulse hammered against my ribs like fists against a cell door. I knew he was talking about me. I left soaked in sweat, heart thudding like a drumbeat of judgment. And I knew if I didn't act soon, he would. So I set the plan in motion. I told them I needed to move a truck. Routine work. I left at dawn, no radio, just steel in my chest and God on mute. I drove for hours. Every mile farther felt like a crack of light through prison bars. Then I saw the checkpoint. Not federal, not military. Our men. They didn't say a word, just pulled me from the truck and shoved me into the back of a Suburban. I knew where we were going before we even turned off the road. The warehouse, the table, and him. He was waiting, seated like a confessor or a judge. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply said my full name, then my mother's, then my sister's, things I'd told him in whispers in the dark when I still believed he was a man of God. Then he laid out two objects, a pistol and a rosary. "Choose," he said. "Either return to the flock with loyalty or die knowing you broke the covenant." And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, 3 men were dragged in. Hooded, bound, federal agents, the ones investigating his money trails. "Your penance," he said. "Show me your faith." I did what he asked. I don't need to tell you what I did, but I will tell you this. When it was over, the blood mixed with incense in the air, and I felt like I had just crucified myself. He placed the rosary around my neck. "You are forgiven," he said. "Now go. But never forget, your soul belongs to me." And he was right, because even if I left the cartel behind, I would never outrun him. I crossed the border under a false name with a forged passport and just enough cash to vanish. New clothes, new language, a cheap apartment in a city where no one asked questions. For a while it worked. I became a ghost. No cartel, no missions, no shadows in the rearview mirror. But I never truly escaped, because the one thing I couldn't outrun was him. Every time I stepped into a church just to sit, just to remember who I used to be, I felt eyes watching me from the altar. Every time I heard bells ring, my skin crawled. And every time I saw a rosary hanging from a rearview mirror wrapped around an old woman's wrist, I smelled incense and blood. He had followed me, not in person, not in body, but in memory, in belief, in guilt. Some nights I'd wake up drenched in sweat, his voice echoing in my head. God forgives the faithful, but never the traitor. And the worst part, a part of me still believed him. Because what if he was right? What if everything I did, all the killings, the executions, the false peace, wasn't just cartel business, but divine will twisted by human hands? I tried to forget. I tried therapy. I tried silence. I even tried prayer. But prayer was his language. And every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see God. I saw him. Sometimes I wonder if I ever had a choice. If my path was decided the moment I stood guard outside that finca in Morelos. Or maybe, the moment I let a man in robes sprinkle holy water on a rifle and call it justice. I've lived in 4 countries, changed identities 5 times, burned every document that could tie me to who I was. But he's still there, in my head, in my bloodstream, like a cross branded onto my soul. I see news reports, cartels still rising, villages still praying, the church still silent. I know he's out there, maybe older, maybe slower, but still pulling strings, still baptizing bullets, still keeping his little black notebook. And I know one day he'll come for me, not with a gun, not even with words. He won't need them. Because the curse he placed on me wasn't in the threats, it was in the belief. I don't know what forgiveness looks like anymore. I don't know if I deserve it. But I do know this. The Beltrán Leyvas had guns. They had money. They had power. But he had God. And that made him unstoppable. So if you ever wonder how faith becomes a weapon, just remember, I carried a crucifix into battle. I confessed before massacres. I was cleansed before I got dirty. And the man who blessed me, he wasn't a priest. He was a warden of souls. And I was just one of his prisoners chained to heaven with blood on my hands and a rosary around my neck.